Okay, so this meeting is this session is being recorded. I'm going to speak a little bit tonight about acid-base balance. The equation in front of you is probably the most important equation you have to learn in not just acid-base balance, but urinary and in buffer systems and 264 and so forth. This is the bicarbonate buffer equation, and this equation really helps us understand how buffering occurs in our bodies and why there are certain reasons that we ultimately have to, and that's wrong, I just realized. That's wrong. It's actually HCO3 minus, let me find my little pointer. Okay, so that's not an H2, whoever did this, because I actually got it from a text, did it incorrectly. So, way to go, huh? Let's see, let me do something about that. Let's just mark it out. There. Perfect. Okay. Oh, I guess I have to leave that there. All right, so this, as I mentioned, is a bicarbonate buffer system, and it helps us in understanding that acid-base balance. So when we talk about acid-base balance, we're really talking about how our body maintains its normal pH. And your study guide's good to point out that the pH of body fluids really varies depending on what we're talking about. But if we talk mainly about our interstitial fluids, so what's happening in our body, in most of our cells, and in the arterial system, so the system that of the blood that is moving away from the heart, that's all fairly close to pH of 7.4 with very little fluctuation. Other fluids such as pancreatic fluid, prostate fluid, actually urine, they all have varying pHs depending on the needs, even in skeletal muscle, depending on the amount of lactic acid, that type of thing. But ideally, for most enzymes to work, we need to have it around pH of 7.4. So whenever we see anything a little bit above that, say 7.45 and above, we consider that an alkalosis or basic condition. We use the term alkalosis, though, or alkaline for base, which means we have an excess of either hydroxide or perhaps bicarbonate, and we're tying up all those free hydrogen ions. That doesn't happen too much naturally, but it can. On the other hand, anything that's a little more acidic, so anything below 7.35 or so, we're in an acidosis condition, or we're having some acute acidosis depending on what the situation is. And we actually don't, in fact, we don't actually do very well when our body's out of acid-base balance. I'm going to show you a diagram that you don't have in, let's see, is this it? Hang on, I'm looking for it. Sometimes, oh, there they are. This one isn't one that we've given you, but I'm going to go ahead and kind of share this with you. It's on a public anatomy and physiology text that I reviewed a while ago. And you can see that we have symptoms of, maybe, green arrow. Fine. It's okay. Green arrow's not going to be helpful. So on the left-hand side, we have symptoms of acidosis. So if your pH starts to drop, you have excess hydrogen ions, or another way we often think of it as excess CO2, which can convert to free hydrogen ions. We start having this nervous system depression, really, as far as the ability to control. And so you get increased heart rate, arrhythmia, seizures, weakness, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, shortness of breath, coughing, and ultimately a person can die. They can lose consciousness, go into a coma, and to die in an extremely acidotic condition. On the other hand, with alkalosis, you see that once again this inability of the nervous system to compensate for these changes. A lot of that has to do with enzymes. Enzymes usually require a very narrow pH in order to function properly. So if our enzymes aren't functioning properly, then we see the nervous system kind of goes wacky. But here we have, once again, you get this stupor, you get to go into a coma, you actually can die, you have numbness, you have twitching, you have nausea and vomiting as well. So it's one of those things that's actually very important for the homeostasis of the body is to maintain pH. All right, let's go back to our equation. The reason I bring this equation up, and I kept the correction I had to make, but the reason I bring this up is this is probably our first and foremost, most immediate way that we maintain pH is we utilize buffers. We utilize buffers in the blood. We utilize buffers in body fluids. Buffers, if you recall from 264, are weak acids and the salts of that weak acid. Another term for salt is a conjugate base, which is what your term in the study guide uses. And the carbonic acid is a good example of that. So we have carbon dioxide and water coming together to form. Let's see if it lets me do this now. Nope, it doesn't. Coming together to form bicarbonate, carbonic acid, which further dissociates into free hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And this is bicarbonate is HCO3 minus, and H plus is the free hydrogen ion. pH, is everyone should recall, is a measurement of free hydrogen ion in a system or in a solution. And so what happens with this buffer is if we start seeing an excess of hydrogen ion, the equation kind of tips to a different way. And so you can tie them up with extra bicarbonate and then just create CO2 and water. And I'll talk about that importance in a minute. On the other hand, if for some reason we're losing hydrogen ions, then we can combine the CO2 that we have with water to kind of create more. And so this kind of fluctuates back and forth. It doesn't, as a buffer, it doesn't actually prevent the change from occurring. It just kind of resists that change from happening as quickly. So it can't make more carbon or bicarbonate to tie up the extra hydrogen ions, and it can't necessarily cause this equation to stay one way or the other. And so the blood, even though that's a second-to-second type of regulation, it can get overwhelmed, actually, and it can get overwhelmed, with fairly common circumstances. So we have to go to a different system, and these systems all kind of work together, but you see kind of the order of what happens. So, second to second, we use buffers in the blood often that will help us only have small changes in pH. When that system gets overwhelmed, or when it has to do with something a little bit more, so more quantities, then we have to go over to the respiratory system. When we talked about the respiratory system a little bit last week, and you learned more about the respiratory system, and you know that CO2 as a gas, that's something that we can actually sorry, my green arrow just hates me. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's go back to draw. Oh, that's why, because I have draw on, so it doesn't like it when I do that. All right, anyway, CO2 is carbon dioxide in its gaseous form. That's something we can easily get rid of in our system, or we can keep it in by regulating our breathing. Even though we can breathe while we're unconscious, because of the skeletal muscles involved, breathing is considered a voluntary action. You can change the way you breathe. And so in doing so, with respiratory system can very quickly, within a matter of several seconds to a few minutes, regulate pH to a point. So if, for instance, if we have excess hydrogen ions, if we are really having a lot of hydrogen ions, then one thing we can do is blow off a lot of CO2, and that forces these two to kind of combine, because this stays in equilibrium and creates extra CO2 in water. On the other hand, if we've lost a lot of hydrogen ions, we can hold in our CO2 rather than expel it, and that extra CO2 will combine with the water, which is plenty in our body, and create some free hydrogen ions to keep it balanced. And so the respiratory system works in conjunction with those buffers, but it can help us with maintaining or preventing the changes in pH perhaps that we don't want to observe in our system based on what may happen. Well, ultimately, even though we can regulate CO2, there's still a limiting factor of bicarbonate. And that's where the urinary system comes in. And that's why we wait until we talk about the urinary system to talk about acid-base balance, because our kidneys are really the most powerful defense against changes in pH. What happens as you're learning this week and early next week is that the filtration process, and as well as reabsorption and secretion and all that functionality in the kidneys through the nephrons actually allow us to either retain bicarbonate or release extra hydrogen ions. And so you ultimately, in order to get a stable pH and get back to a normal pH, always are going to have to incorporate the urinary system. Unfortunately, this takes several hours and sometimes days. And so those three systems kind of try to work in conjunction to get the pH maintained at a steady, normal pace. Unfortunately, when that doesn't happen is when we actually see problems with acidosis and alkalosis as a condition. Now, as I mentioned in the notes from instructor, about 70% is estimated of the people that are in the hospital for whatever reason are either in the hospital because they have an acid-base balance disorder or have an acid-base balance disorder in addition to their primary concern. So that's quite a bit. It's something that they are constantly monitoring, specifically when we have certain situations about with acid-base balance, because once again, you saw any real deviation can cause some major problems, including, death, which is never a good thing if you're trying to get better in the hospital. So what I want to show you briefly, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. I'm trying to think which one would be easier. Let's look at this one. This is another, okay, this is a good one, and hopefully Mr. Arrow, there we go. Okay, so you have a homeostasis disturb. In other words, your pH either decreases, which is acidosis, or increases, which is alkalosis. First, we're going to go down the acidosis side, and then I'll give you some examples. There are at least 3, I think there might be 4 questions about acid-base balance disorders on your next exam. It's also something that we see in almost every system because of the prevalence of how pH can change in our bodies. Urinary is, like I said, kind of the final step, but we see it in respiration. So it may actually see application in other questions as well and in other systems as well. So I do think it's an important concept to really understand. So first of all, if you have a decrease in pH, you get an acidic condition, or we end up in acidosis. Well, what happens is this, your brain is very sensitive. In fact, it's more sensitive to a buildup of CO2 than it is to a lack of oxygen, because a buildup of CO2 can create more free hydrogen ions, which can draw down the pH. And so what you see is there's a stimulation here of brain and arterial receptors. We increase our respiration rate. We decrease our blood CO2 because then we know we can force that buffer equation to move to the other side to create more. And then in doing so, we also will decrease the amount of free carbonic acid, and then ultimately that will help increase our pH. The opposite then also happens if we don't have enough free hydrogen ions. We will decrease our respiration rate and therefore increasing our blood CO2, which then increases free hydrogen ions because we're increasing our carbonic acid and lowering the pH. And so then you get a restoration. So this is the basic thing that happens. Now, where the question comes in and where a lot of students actually miss is the type of origin of the acidosis or alkalosis. So why are we more acidic? Why are we more basic? And then what is the body doing to try to help? So let's look at this. Is a really old table, so I don't know how clearly it comes up. It takes forever to come up too, but it talks a little bit about it, and it has some extra things that we don't really concern ourselves too much with, but it does have at least a good, I don't know, a good viewpoint, I think, of what's happening and what the compensation is. So it's almost there. Here we go. All right, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this. Like I said, it's an old one, but it's showing that you have essentially 4, we won't worry too much about acute versus chronic alkalosis, but you have basically 4 different acid-base disorders. You have a metabolic acidosis and alkalosis and a respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. And so the primary effect, let's just look at metabolic acidosis. This is, for example, someone who maybe is diabetic and gets into a ketoacidosis state, too much production of an acid. You're going to see a a large decrease in bicarbonate ion. And because of that, you're going to try to um, blow off CO2. So in hyperventilation, we blow off a lot of CO2. We're trying to decrease or drop the partial pressure of CO2 so that that free hydrogen ion can combine with the bicarbonate and then ultimately becomes stable. The opposite, of course, happens in the opposite effect with alkalosis. A hypoventilation would be like blowing into a paper bag. You're trying to increase the CO2, partial pressure of CO2, so it will force the CO2 to mix. You know, that equation is a balanced equation. So if we have excess of CO2, we add water, we'll get more free hydrogen ions. Now in respiratory, if you have acute acidosis in respiratory, or even chronic acidosis actually, what's happening is that there's something not allowing proper exchange to take place with CO2 and O2, and you're not exhaling like you should. And for those of you in lab, that might be a little bit easier to understand because we talked a little bit about restrictive diseases. But someone, for instance, that is a heavy smoker and has damage to their alveoli would have probably more of a likelihood of having acidosis, chronic acidosis. And so what we see is we have high amounts of PCO2 that aren't getting out of the system. And to compensate for that, we have to save more bicarbonate. The more bicarbonate we can save, the more we can here compensate for the excess CO2. We can tie it up, so we can break it down and then tie it up. And so the opposite is the effect with alkalosis. If with alkalosis you're not, say for example, a hyperventilation is a perfect example of acute alkalosis. You have really low PCO2. You're going to have somewhat compensation trying to decrease that bicarbonate. Maybe we excrete more in the urine, that type of thing. Once again, this is a compensation in the kidneys in order to get back at homeostasis. And so one of the examples that your study guide gives is, and let's look at that, if I can pull it up here. Let's see. It suggests, oops, that's the wrong one. Hang on. I printed this up because I've had students ask about it. Let me just find it. Okay, so this patient is experiencing nausea for several days, and you notice that she's shaky and that she's lightheaded and is kind of confused. Now, based on what we saw before, here, let's go back to this. If she's shaky, and oops, come on, come with me. Okay, she's shaky, if she's confused, if she's nauseated, if she's likely, especially the shakiness, she's probably in some type of alkalosis situation. And then the idea is, okay, is it metabolic or is it respiratory? Well, respiratory has to do with her breathing and where she's, let's see, what else does she's nausea for several days. It doesn't say why, she's just nauseated. Okay, so you know she may have been throwing up, she may have lost some electrolytes, including some hydrogen ion, which is a good example of an alkalosis condition. So what we see though, when you look at her values, at least the ones in the study guide, is that her bicarbonate is high and so is her PCO2. So it's like, well, that doesn't really make sense. Her arterial pH is 7.49, which is high, which means she is in an alkalosis state. So one has to decide, well, is that metabolic or respiratory? And that's when you kind of look at the symptoms and what's happening. So what happens is we see, one, she's alkalosis because she's higher pH. So she's likely, normally, as you recall, a high PCO2 means a respiratory acidosis. But she has a basic pH. So she is really a metabolic alkalosis condition. So why does she have a high PCO2? Well, because her body's trying to compensate. And I guess that's where I'm trying to go with this. And I don't really have a good visual for that, but whatever the disorder is, so if the disorder is respiratory alkalosis, the compensation is going to be the opposite. your body's going to try to create a metabolic alkalosis condition for a respiratory acidosis. And the same thing here, where the patient has a metabolic alkalosis condition because she's nauseated, it's going to really suggest that her body's going to try to go into an acidic condition and use the respiratory system. And so whatever the disease is that you decide, whatever it's metabolic or respiratory alkalosis or acidosis, the compensation is the opposite. So just think of that. If it's metabolic, the opposite of that is respiratory. If it's acidosis, the opposite of that is alkalosis, and that's what your body's trying to do. So your body tries to compensate by doing the opposite. Okay, great. And that is a really important key. If you can get that down, it actually makes it a lot easier to distinguish. And of course, pH is a big clue on that, on whether it's going to be positive or if it's going to be acidic or basic. And then you look at the situation and oh, I did not. Okay, so this is also not from, I thought this was from your study guide, but it's not. I'm going to pull this page up. Once again, this is from a chapter from a text that I was asked to review, Anatomy and Physiology. What's it called? Free-based type text where you can get it online. Let me try to zoom in here. I don't know, can you see that table fairly well, Melanie? This common causes. Okay, so some of the common causes of metabolic acidosis. So you have too much hydrogen ion would be, like diarrhea, diabetic ketoacidosis, strenuous exercise. The others, methanol, paraldehyde, isopropanol, glycol, aspirin, those are all intake. In fact, it says that, I think, down here. The last 5 causes result from ingestion. The first 3 happen to be conditions. So if someone's vomiting a lot or diarrhea, they can end up in a metabolic acidosis mainly because of the loss of bicarbonate. So you can see the metabolite here, why it's causing it. And so know that the opposite of that would be respiratory alkalosis if you have metabolic acidosis. And it's one of those things that is there's going to be a couple of examples. Smoking's one usually for metabolic acidosis as well. Trying to think what else. High protein diets often will bring about acidic condition because of the breakdown of amino acids. Trying to think what else we often use. High altitude is a different matter, but it can cause an acid-base balance disturbance because of the lack of oxygen. And sometimes we see that lack of oxygen concurrent with a buildup of CO2. And let me see, if you wait just a second, if I can find it, I'll see what other examples we may use. Diabetics, that's an example that's often used in quizzes and in the exam because that becomes a ketoacidosis condition. And let's see. Once again, respiratory alkalosis would be somebody who is blowing off, hyperventilating. And of course, that's never a good thing, but it happens. Okay, so diabetes, respiratory would do, like I said, with increased smoking or maybe some other restrictive diseases. So as you're going through trying to study those, just kind of give yourself different scenarios of why would it be metabolic versus respiratory. Obviously, with anything to do with someone who's smoking or impaired lung function, radon, for example, is equivalent, supposedly. Radon exposure long-term is the same as being a smoker. It's kind of a scary thing. They've been advertising that a lot or trying to discuss that a lot here in the South Valley of the Salt Lake Valley because they found about a third of the houses in the area we live in, South Jordan and Harriman, that area, have radon, higher levels of radon exposure, which, like I said, can lead to lung cancer and the same detrimental effects as being a long-term smoker. So that's cancer, but there could also be, if there's impairment in that ability for breathing and releasing CO2, you could see a respiratory acidosis condition. So that's just a little bit more about acid-base balance. I don't know if you have any specific questions, about that, but that's something that students miss a lot. They get the disorder correct and then they miss the compensation for some reason. And so once again, just remember opposite, 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 opposite. I'm going to go ahead and stop this, or at least pause it.